Hi everyone! In this video I'm going to show you how to make a beautiful fabric material in Substance Designer from start to finish. I'll be using a very simple workflow and walk you through each step so that you should be able to follow along even if you're a beginner. I will assume though that you know your way around the interface and understand the basics of Substance node-based workflow. So let's begin by creating an empty graph. I already named and saved mine, make sure you do the same on your side. And the first thing I'm gonna do is to create a basic setup that will allow us to preview what we are doing in the 3D viewport. To do that, I'm going to create a base material node. Alright, I'm going to drag and drop it onto my preview mesh. And you'll notice that it has turned our cube metallic, and that's because under the material preset it is set to custom and we want to make it dielectric, which means non-metallic. And while we're at it, we might also increase the roughness a bit. Alright, right now it doesn't show us anything because it has no input, so we'll need to feed him some information, and to do that we have to enable those inputs in the base material properties here at the bottom. I'm going to enable two of them, the normal and the ambient occlusion. Those two maps will allow us to quickly preview in the viewport what we are doing as we start building our material. Right. And since we are working on a rather flat material, I'm going to crank up the normal up to 6. And on the other hand, I might lower a bit the occlusion intensity to something like 0.07. Alright, we are now ready to go. Let me just bring in my reference so that you know where we're headed. So this piece of cloth I found on the Metropolitan Museum collection. If we start to break down the complexity, it boils down to two elements. There's a base weft here in green, and we have our ornament in gold or yellow right here. So it means we have to make two things: the base weft and a second weft on top of it, right? So let's do that. And let's take some space and start with the first one. I'm going to show you the lazy way of doing it first. Let's grab a uniform color, turn it to grayscale and increase it a bit, like 0.3. Alright, now that node will serve as an intensity controller, so to say, for the weft, because I'm going to blend it right now. And as you can see in our blend, we have an opacity controller, so that if I blend my weft on top of that uniform gray, I can always bring back the uniformity through the opacity controller. So you'll see what I'm talking about just in a minute. So we can already plug that to a normal, to our AO, and start building our weft. So if you type weave in your filter menu, you'll see that Designer already provides us with a bunch of interesting patterns, and I'm going to choose weave 2. And as you can see, it gives a kind of slanted pattern that I find quite interesting. I'm going to scale it up to 64, and I'm going to duplicate it, rotate that second version, and add just a bit of disorder, something like 0.05. Alright, and I'm going to blend those two together and set the blend to max. And you can see what it's doing. It gives us a kind of crisscross pattern. Let's plug that into our blend to preview it. So right now it's way too intense, of course, so let's make some changes. I'm going to set the blend to multiply, and I'm going to lower it to something like 0.3. And that's already better. Okay, now that base is still way too clean and uniform. So we'll need to make some changes, and I'd like to add a bit of imperfections and fraying. And to do that, I'm going to use a very powerful node when it comes to fabrics, and that is the multi-directional warp grayscale. So let's just plug our weft here. And it's a node that works very well with stuffed noises like Gaussians and Perlin. So I'm going to call a Gaussian noise. Okay. I'm going to increase it a lot, like 250. Right. I'm going to plug it into my warp. And right now it doesn't look like much, but we need to make a few changes. Set the warp mode to max and decrease the intensity. And you can see what it's doing, right? It's kind of splitting the threads and fraying, and it's awesome. So I'm going to set it to 1.5. Let's preview what we are doing. Redistributing the connection. All right, looking good. Much more realistic. Now, even though I like that result, I still find that that weft is too large. So I'm simply going to take a 2D transform and divide it by 2. Okay, we now have a good basis for our fabric. But we don't want just a plain fabric, right? We want some kind of brocade or embroidered ornament on top of it. So to do that, we need two things. Let me bring back my reference. So we have our weft and at the base here, and we now need two things. We need another type of weft, like those yellow threads here, and we need a mask to tell where on the fabric that weft should appear. So let's bring back our graph and let's start by building that second weft first. So I'm going to type blend, and so our second weft will come here. For this one, I'll walk you through another way of doing it. It will take a bit more time, but you'll also have more control over the final result. To begin, let's create a thread, one single thread. That will be the building block of our weft. So I'm going to type fiber, and fibers 1 is what I choose. Okay. So first I'm going to use a 2D transform to kind of squash it horizontally, like so. Remember when doing that to go to the tiling mode here, set it to absolute and remove the tiling. We don't need it. Okay, so now I want to increase the details that go right here. And to do that, I'm going to take an anisotropic noise, maybe lower a bit the number. It's up to you, you can play with the settings, of course. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply it on top of my thread, maybe lower a bit the intensity, and I'm going to rotate the anisotropic so that it matches roughly the direction of the fibers. Okay, like so. We can always come back to it later. And lastly, I'm going to trim the edges a bit because I don't want any hard transition. So to do that, I like to use a bell. So let's call for a shape. Choose bell. Make it a bit more squashed, so to say. I'm going to increase a bit on the X, level it so that we have a wider area, and multiply it. Okay. So this should do the trick. Now what we need to do, of course, and I think you guessed it, is that we need to tile it. And what best for a tiling operation than a tile sampler? So let's type tile and choose a tile sampler. So this is a great node for making fabrics because, as you can see, it has a lot of controllers and you can pretty much do anything with it. But it can be intimidating for that reason because you have so many menus and sliders and all. So for the purpose of this video, I'll keep it simple, so don't worry and just follow me. So I'm going to take my fiber here, my thread, my yarn, and I'm going to plug it into the pattern input. Now, under the pattern menu, I am going to set it as pattern input. Okay, right now it doesn't look like much because we need to increase the numbers of particles. So I'm going to type 150 for the X and 160 for the Y. And now we can't see anything, and that's because we need to increase the scale. So you see, right, I'm going to go with 5. I'm going to add a bit of randomness. Right now it's too uniform, so I will randomize a bit on the Y, which is the width of the thread. Hopefully you can see what it's doing, right? So I'm going to keep it pretty low, like 0.1, okay. Then I'm going to scroll down to the position tab and I'm going to offset. So at 0.5, and I'm going to set it at vertical. All right, now you can see what it's giving us. Now we need to keep randomizing a bit things, so I'm going to add a slight randomness. No, maybe this is too low, so 0.01 should work. Okay. And I'm going to randomize the color to 0.15 and lower a bit the luminance to 0.7. Okay, so now we have a solid basis. It looks already like a weft. So same thing as before, I find it a bit too large as is, so I'm going to divide it by 2. I could, of course, go back to the X and Y amount and increase it, but then it would mess with my other parameters, so I'd rather simply divide it by 2. Okay. We now have our second weft. So let's take a step back and just frame what we've been doing so far so that we don't get lost. So we have our base weft or first weft, we can call it weft 1, make it green, and we have our weft 2 and make it gold, so to say. All right. And so if you remember, we want our second weft to come on top of the first one. Easy, right? So I am going to take that weft and blend it with the first one. But you can already guess what the problem will be. If I redistribute, the problem is that our new weft completely overrides the first one. To fix this, we need to create a grayscale map that we will plug into the opacity socket of the blend node. This input is very important and I rely heavily on it in most of my works. It can be used to add randomness to a blend, which is very useful for organic materials with damage and so on, but it can also be used in scenarios such as ours, where we want to reveal a certain pattern, right? So we need a mask. So what should it look like exactly? Well, the idea is that it should be white where we want the ornament to appear and black where it should stay hidden. Now there's a couple ways we can do this. The first one is the procedural way. Using shapes, warps and 2D transforms, we can create our own ornament mask from scratch. The good thing about this is that you can make changes at any point of the process and iterate quickly, but the drawback is that it's taking way too much time to create in the first place. And besides, we don't really need to iterate if we can get the ornament right the first time. Remember, not everything has to be procedural in Substance Designer. The fastest solution is often the best one. The other approach, the one that I would recommend for a project like this, is importing a bitmap into your graph. Now, you can draw it yourself in Photoshop or whatever software you're using, and I really like that workflow because you can export different masks using your layer system and keep it non-destructive. Now, if you don't want to bother with the process of drawing the mask by hand and all, or if you found something interesting online that suits you, you can import it straight into Designer and start working on it. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. So let's go back to our graph. I'm going to type bitmap, choose from file, and I'm going to choose that mask over here. Open. I'm going to import it. Most of the time I would usually link my bitmaps so that I can tweak them and then it would update on the fly in Designer, which is awesome. But here I don't need that, so I'm just going to click on import. And here is our mask. Now, as you can see, it tiles and it's pretty clean. So I didn't draw that mask, if you were wondering, and I didn't either made it procedurally with shapes and warps and all. Instead, I found an old photo of a middle-aged cloth online and I really liked it, so I decided to work from here. Now let me show you how I cleaned it up, because I didn't do it with a photo editing software, I did it with Designer. And so I brought that so that I could show you how I made it. So this is the original picture that I found. And as you can see, let me just take that down. As you can see, this image is not ready to be used as a mask quite yet. It has the wrong ratio. It's pretty low quality. It's blurry. It has a lot of unwanted gradients and all, so I needed to do a bit of cleanup first. And what I did is pretty simple. I squashed it a bit. It was a bit stretching, even if it doesn't show too much, but I squashed it a bit. Then I multiplied it with a blurred square to clean up the edges and remove that white frame that you can see over here. And then to tile it, I plugged it into a tile sampler and lowered the amount to 1, tweaked a bit the scale, and most importantly, I offsetted it on the X so that I have a seamless transition. I simply then took that result and blended my original version with it, and then I leveled it to have a sharp black and white mask. And that's it. That's how I made that bitmap over here. So we now have a mask. All we have to do is to plug it into the opacity slot of our blend. And ta-da! This is what it's doing. So you can already see that, okay, it's better, but it's still a bit off. And the reason for that is that our mask right now is too clean and too sharp, and it's not organic enough, and it doesn't look like fabric, right? So the first thing we need to fix is that sharpness. So I'm going to bring a blur and keep it low, like 0.3, just to get rid of those hard edges. Then I'm thinking that second weft that we just made, this one, it should somehow pinch on the edges of the mask where it kind of sinks into the weft. So how can I do that? The simplest option here is to use a warp. So let's do that. I'm going to enlarge that frame and I'm going to call for warp. Let's bring our mask down. Now the warp is a very sensitive node, so if you input something too sharp or too detailed in it, it will break. So here, let me just re-explain. I am taking my weft, my second weft, and I am warping it with my blurred mask, okay? Now right now you can see that it's too strong and I need to make a few adjustments to make it look good. So the first adjustment I will make is I'm going to blur a second time the mask. And something very low, once again, 0.3 works, just to soften the edges. I'm going to plug it into my warp and I'm going to decrease the intensity of the warp. And I'm going to be pretty drastic with it, like 0.01. And here we go. You can already see what it's doing, right? It's pinching parts of the weft, and that is exactly what we want. So to show you better what it's doing, I'm going to blend it with the mask in multiply mode so that your eyes can pick up the edges. No, multiply. All right. And I'm going to duplicate that and use my non-warped fabric so that you can compare. So this is the original and this is the warped version. So I don't know if you can see, but here on the warped version we have some dynamic pinching and distortions that are really more organic and convincing than here. Okay? So let me get rid of that, and I am going to change that so we can preview. Okay, so you already see what it's doing, but it's not enough. Next thing we want to do is to make changes to the mask itself. Right now all we do is blur it, and by the way I didn't plug the blurred version. Alright, that's already better. But what I'd like to do next is to break those edges a bit. Alright, so to do that I'm going to actually do the same process as we did with the weft, but inverted. And instead of using a warp, I'm going to use once again a multi-directional warp. Okay, and I'm going to take the weft as an input. I am going to set the mode to min because I want the mask to be kind of worn out. And I'm going to decrease the intensity, something like 1.5, 2 maybe. Okay, let's see. Great. This may not look like much, but it's really adding something. It is breaking down the flat, sharp shape that we had. And actually, I am going to maybe increase that. Yeah, something like 4, 3 or 4. That's maybe better. I don't know. Once again, feel free to tweak the settings to your own liking. Now, there's one last thing I like to do with that mask. And so far, we've been focusing on the edges, and I like to focus now on the white areas in the middle, because right now they are pure white and it's not realistic. So I'm going to blend that white with a noise. And since I want to keep the direction of the threads, I'm going to go with a directional noise. Anisotropic would do the job perfectly. So let me take him and subtract. Actually, I'm going maybe increase it a bit and decrease my opacity operation to 0.5. Okay. So here I noticed that by redistributing my connections, I actually plugged the wrong mask. Yeah, it doesn't change anything really, but let's keep it clean if we can. And here we go. So now we have our mask that is blurred, warped, and partially subtracted with the noise, and this is what it gets us, and that is already way more convincing than the first map. So this may not look like much, but this little mask that we created is going to be super useful to build our other maps later. Now let's go back to our main blend here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to decrease the overall opacity of it, and I want to let the base weft kind of appear through the ornament so that we have a more noisy base. I like it much better this way. It's more subtle and more organic looking. At this point, we could move on and start building our albedo and roughness maps. And I mean, we have what we were looking for, right? We have a base weft here. We have our second weft, and we have a mask to distribute those two along an ornament pattern. But I still find it too clean and too flat. So I'm going to add one last pass to our height map. So I'm going to add blend. And right now it's too flat because it has no wrinkles, no folds, no imperfection, no large scale imperfection, because we have small scale imperfection, remember? We used a multi-directional warp to fray some of our threads, but it's not enough because we want large scale, macro imperfection. And so to do that, I'm going to call for a node that is called creased, and it does exactly what it says. It adds wrinkle and folds to a surface. Now, right now, I'm going to make a few adjustments to it. Actually, let's just preview what we are doing here. Okay, I'm going to set it to add, and I'm going to lower the opacity to 0.5. Okay, so you can already see what it's doing, right? So I'd like to tweak it a bit. I'm going to increase the scale, increase maybe the warp intensity a bit, like 0.5. So right now it's too sharp, too uniform, so we need to make a few adjustments. I'm going to warp it like so, grabbing a purlin. I'm going to lower a bit the scale. Okay. So right now it's way too intense, of course, so we are going to change that, and we are going to do that by blurring it. Maybe let's just try. Okay, two seems fine. Okay, so I could leave it as is, saying okay, we have our wrinkles or folds, but I think it's maybe too intense and it's too uniform. It's affecting all of our fabric, and we don't want that. Damages, wrinkles, folds, fraying, all that kind of operations, it can't affect all of your fabric or all of your material. It has to be more in certain places and less in other areas. So that's what I'm going to do. I am going to plug another map into the opacity of this operation, And I'm going to be lazy about it. I am simply going to duplicate that, make a few changes, decreasing the warp, scaling up, maybe decrease the scale of the purlin too. I'm going to keep the blur to avoid hard edges, and I'm going to level it a bit. Something like that. Alright, and you see what it's doing. Maybe it's too dark. Okay. So right now, just to explain what I'm doing, our folds here affects only the lighter areas of our mask. So that's good. I think it's enough, and I think we can just frame that, calling it folds. Whoops. And we are good. Our height map is now complete, which means we can now move on to the other maps. But before we start working on our other maps, like the base color, the roughness and all, I'd like to change the mesh on which I am previewing the material. The default cube is great to keep a close watch on the height map, but to visualize how our material will look as an actual fabric, I find it best to apply it to a cloth mesh. So let me import the one that I have in my tutorial dependency. So I'm going to go to link and select 3D mesh. And here I'm choosing my display fabric. And here it is. A beautiful cloth mesh. It's great to preview the subtle changes and the way our fabric will react to light and shadows and all that stuff. Now, if I drag and drop my material onto that mesh, you can see that it breaks everything, and that's because under the material preset, I go to edit, I need to turn my scale off completely, right? So here we go, we are now ready to move forward. I might also increase the tiling up to 2. So far we only display 2 maps on our mesh, which is the normal and the AO. So I'm going to pan to my base material here, and I'm going to start enabling other maps. And I'll begin with the base color, or the albedo. So I'm going to set it to true, and it will turn our material black because it has no input. No worries. So to lay out my base color map, I usually start with a curvature map. And to get this map, you simply type curvature, and I choose curvature smooth. And as you can see, it has a yellow input, which means it's taking a color input, and in that case it's taking a normal information. Right now it's okay, but I find it a bit flat, a bit dull. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate my normal, and I'm going to double its intensity. And to show you the difference, okay. It's making it a bit more contrasted, and it's giving us a good basis to start adding some colors. So I'm going to type gradient map, and this is a very powerful node that allows you not only to convert grayscale to color, but also to sample colors from a reference image. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to my gradient editor. I'm going to bring back my reference and use those swatches as samples. Okay. So we have our green basis. I'm going to just clean it up a bit and find a good balance, like so. So let me plug that into the base color input. Okay, so we now have our green basis. We could leave it as is, of course, but it's a bit too uniform, so I will make a variation of that first green and I will blend it using a noise. So let's do that. Create a blend. I'm going to duplicate that first gradient map and change just maybe the value, increase it a bit to make it lighter. I don't know, something like that. And I'm going to blend it on top of my base. And as for the opacity input, I will choose a soft noise like a cloud. Cloud 1 seems fine. Okay. And I'm going to bring that to my base color. Great. So now it has a bit of variations and changes that make it look more organic. Now, as you might have guessed, we need to do the same, but for the ornament, that is for our second weft. So I'm going to duplicate my gradient here, and in my gradient editor, I'm going to bring back my reference, and I'm going to pick that gradient. And same as before, I'm going to make a bit of a cleanup. Maybe increase the contrast, something like that, looks fine. So now we need to blend that orange node to the green one here. And since we want the orange to affect only the ornaments, we are going to need a mask. So let's go get him and plug it. I'm going to take the last version of the mask, this one, and voila. We now have our ornaments in orange and our base weft in green, just like we want it. Let's plug it, and now we have an idea of what it looks like. Already it looks pretty fine. But same as for the greens, I find that orange is too uniform, too clean. So I'm going to blend it with itself. And I'm going to use, since, as you remember, I want to keep it directional here. You can see the direction of my anisotropic noise here. So I'm going to keep that. And I'm going to bring another anisotropic. And use it as a mask. And I'm going to set my blending to multiply. So right now it's too strong. I might also increase the amount. And let's just preview. Good. That's what I wanted. To have a bit more intensity on some parts. Maybe increase it a bit. And bringing the values up here. Right, that's better. I could also do the same operation as here, and I'm going to do it another way. I'm going to blend it, but instead of creating another gradient map and changing the pins, I'm going to type HSL and just lighten it up a bit. Something like, I don't know. Let's just try. I'm going to take that noise that we already used, that clouds one. And you can see the difference. It's adding that same large scale variation to our ornaments. And I think that is good. We don't have to add anything more to the base color map. And so the next map we should tackle is the metallic. So if I go back to my base material presets, I'm going to scroll down to my maps and I'm going to enable the metallic. All right. Now, just a few words about this one. According to the PBR rules, a material is either metallic or non-metallic, and so the map is either black or white. In certain scenarios, such as rusty iron, for example, you can have nuances, but most of the time you should avoid messing with those values. So our fabric is obviously not metallic. But in some cases for fabrics, I find that a certain amount of metallicity is needed to make them look really good. So let's do this. Let's break the rules. So I'm going to type level, and I'm going to use that levels to tweak a bit my curvature map. Alright, so I'm taking my curvature, I'm leveling it, and in fact what I'm going to do is I'm going to invert it. Like so, and maybe make it a bit more contrasted. Okay, and I'm going to plug that into my metallic map. So now our fabric is a bit metallic. So I'm going to blend that, because what we need now is of course to bring our ornaments in. And that's the most important thing that this map will help us do, is to enhance the ornaments, to make them quite literally shine. So I'm going to take my mask, and this time I'm going to take one of the earlier version, this one. And I'm going to plug it into my blend, and since I want those ornaments to be more metallic than the rest of the fabric, set it to max. And I'm going to lower the opacity a bit. I don't know, something like 0.5 to start. And I'm going to bring that into my metallic socket. And you see what it's doing. It has turned our ornaments metallic. Almost completely metallic. For now it's just a gray. So if we bring that up a bit, this is better, I think. We are now almost done. Last but not least, we need to build our roughness map. So same as before, I'm going to go to my maps here, and I'm going to enable the roughness. Okay, so I'm going to do the same as with the metallic to start. Duplicate my level, so this is my inverted curvature, and I'm going to make it lighter because I don't want my fabric to be too shiny at first. So just play with the levels a bit and plug that into the roughness. Okay, our fabric is mostly rough. Then, just like we did with the metallic, I'm going to blend our ornament on top of it. So let's bring a blend. Okay, and I could borrow actually the connection here. But this time I'll set the blend to subtract because I want the ornament to be more reflective, that means less rough. And let's just redistribute. And here we go. So right now it's way too reflective, so I'm going to lower that. A bit more. All right, this is looking good. And this is the effect I was after. So a bit metallic and a bit reflective. Now, to add a bit of randomness to that roughness map, we will perform one last operation, one last blend. And this time I'm going to bring in a noise, type directional noise, and I'm going to take the first one, directional noise 1, to scale it up. I'm going to level it a bit to make it darker, like so. And I could leave it as is, but I'd like to perform a quick multi-directional warp, and you see why. So I'm going to go get an anisotropic, and we have one here. And you see what it is doing. It's creating a kind of a vein pattern with sharp transition that I like so. So I'm going to take that and abstract it because I want to add a bit of shiny threads into my fabric. Now right now it's too intense, so maybe 0.3, and let's just preview that. Okay, so you see what it's doing, I hope. I will actually decrease the preview subtract because right now it's too shiny. I don't know, 0.15 maybe. Okay. And so the only issue here is that this operation that we made with the noise, it's affecting all of our fabric, and I want it only on the ornaments. So to do that, it's very simple. I'm going to grab my mask right here. Remember, we took it here. And I'm going to input it into the opacity so that now it only affects the ornaments. Well, our material is now done. It's time to take a step back and see if anything is missing, is everything's working. It seems fine for me. We can now come back to certain settings and make some changes if we like. For example, I can decide that I'd rather have it blue and silver, for example. Why not? So I'm just going to take an HSL just to see if it works. Make it blue. I don't know, 0.55. Yeah, I like it in blue too. I could do the same with the ornaments to make it less saturated. And just in a few clicks, we have a completely different material. So I'm just going to undo that. We could also go back to the root of our graph right here. Remember when I said that this would be like an intensity controller for base weft? Well, we can just test it now. For example, make it more intense. And now you see we have a much rougher material. I'm gonna undo that. But most importantly, we can come back to our mask right here, and I can at any point just bring another bitmap. I have another mask here that I like. I'm going to import it, and if I change my mind about the type of mask I want to do, I can just change it, and now I have a complete different fabric. Awesome. So if you want to know why I love Substance Designer, this is why. I personally use that workflow all the time when making fabrics with ornaments, and once you get the general idea of having different wefts and displaying them using masks, you can do pretty much anything. I hope you found this video informative and that it inspired you to create your own fabric material with Substance Designer. Thank you for watching!